to me, it seems like the economy is reopening, the economy seems to be recovering, people are traveling again, people are coming back to work. Why would capital expenditure fall?
Well, there are a number of reasons. If we look, for example, at what tends to happen in a reopening, is that it seems that there's a big boost in capital expenditure uh, coming from a higher level of growth. But as new orders come in, most of the businesses see that the level of overcapacity and that the strength of demand is actually weaker than what they initially expected. So the mirage of the base effect and the whip effect, no, it's called the bullwhip effect. You first see an incredible increase in orders that come fundamentally from the reopening. Then new capacity comes on stream, and what businesses end up seeing is that there is not so much of a sustainable increase in demand. We're seeing it in the ISM manufacturing index, etc. And therefore, capital expenditure rapidly comes down because the multiplier effect of the stimulus packages is actually much weaker than what the bullwhip effect would initially dictate.
And how does this tie into the inflation expectations we're seeing? Because it would seem to me what you're saying is maybe the demand isn't necessarily there as people see it, but we're seeing incredible inflation readings month on month and even inflation expectations. How does this tie in?
Well, obviously, it will tie in by seeing some moderation in the inflation expectations. We will likely see, for example, we are seeing it already. We see how lumber is coming down very aggressively, how copper, iron ore, etc., start to come down after a big rise at the beginning. But what I find interesting is that they stabilize at a high level of growth, i.e., that although lumber has allegedly collapsed, no, it still is massively above the 5 year levels. So the risk that you may have is that there is a sticky element to that inflationary process that we saw at the beginning that hurts margins and therefore cash flow generation of businesses. And that's why Reuters, for example, is mentioning how the cash flow generation of businesses is weakening and how they're eating up on the pile of cash generated throughout the crisis.
Why is this just because they had cash on hand, they got it, I suppose, at low rates last year, better to spend it than taking on more debt? Is this the reason?
Well, not necessarily. What tends to happen is that when you have last year's crisis was very, very different from other crises. The most of the overall structure of the industry was basically untouched. The only thing that happened was the shutdown of the economy. What happens when you reopen the economy is that costs of goods and services, input prices come up very aggressively for businesses. Therefore, the requirements, the cost of capital requirements of many of the businesses actually goes up. And therefore, the amount of cash that you had basically piled up throughout the crisis is reduced very, very rapidly. That obviously may stabilize in the second part of the year, but what it's showing us at the end is that if we look at what is happening globally, what is happening is that the base effect and the mirage of the reopening are giving a sense of strength of the recovery that is probably not as positive as some would like.
You touched on an interesting point about the type of crisis we saw last year because we had obviously a lot of support from governments and central banks, not just for governments themselves, but for businesses too. Small businesses got help to stay in business, big businesses got help to stay in business. So the structure of the society, of the industry didn't really change. Are we seeing some negative impacts of that, or maybe will we see them sometime in the future?
Well, the biggest obvious negative would be the zombification of many businesses. No, one of the things that tends to happen in a crisis is that there is an element of creative destruction that allows the economy to recover fast. If you almost bail out anything, what happens is that the inefficient businesses uh, can stay alive for longer. No, obviously it's very difficult to decide whether you are zombifying an economy or not when what you have is such a tremendous shock as what we saw last year. But the risk is not necessarily on the policies of 2020; is on the perpetuation of the policies well into a recovery. Miss Judy Shelton and Larry Summers, numerous economists are warning. We have talked about it a number of times that you may accept the uniqueness of the measures implemented in the economic shutdown, but it's very difficult to accept them with such a high level of velocity of the recovery, because then is when you generate the zombification risk, the non-performing loan arising risk. Defaults are increasing, not to the levels of 2008, but they're increasing. And also the risk that basically, for example, you get a lot of slack in the economy that goes from generating inflation at the beginning to creating stagnation afterwards.
Looking at the policymakers either in Europe or here in the United States, what do you expect them to do over the next 3 to 5 years? Are they going to taper back these policies, you feel, or?
Well, there is a very I would say concerning message coming from the international bodies that are saying continue with the massive stimuli. Now continue with the big programs of spending and deficit spending and monetary stimulus well into 2021, even in 2022, because they fear that tapering could actually create a bigger problem. However, they're not taking into account the secondary risks and obviously the perverse incentives of keeping such massive stimulus packages into a recovery that I come back to the point. The problem in 2020 was the lockdowns, and the solution in 2021 is the reopening. No? Obviously, international bodies are saying that what you need to do is to maintain the stimulus packages and the monetary stimulus. All of that sounds all right, but they're not paying attention to the secondary effects, the risks, the zombification, high level of indebtedness, and the increase in the weakness of the fragility of the economy. Stimulus packages have to be extremely carefully designed so that they don't become perverse incentives. And what I believe is that actually, as we are seeing in the United States, the jobs recovery, for example, would be much stronger without the stimulus checks.
This is a really interesting point you mentioned about continuing these policies into 2022, 2023, because obviously they need businesses and consumers to react, right? This is the reason they want to stimulate the economy. But if we're looking at this graph that you tweeted out about the capital expenditure, even amidst all of this stimulus money and stimulus packages and support, capital expenditure is still falling, which would indicate that businesses mightn't be quite as satisfied or content with the level of demand, even with the stimulus packages. Am I right?
Yes, because what happens is that stimulus packages create a false signal of demand, a quick signal of demand. And but obviously businesses are working with 3, 4, 6 months of at least advanced orders, no? And what they see is that that initial sort of bump in demand then goes back to the trend that we were seeing before. But it's important to understand that a business cannot invest more in growth of the business if all of its competitors, the good ones and the bad ones, are being bailed out. So that is the problem of keeping the stimuli into 2021 and 2022, even 2023, is that the zombification actually works as a backlash on productivity growth and therefore on new investment.
And from your experience of working with these big companies, do they, I want to, for want of a better word, do they fall for this false signal? Are there companies out there who see the blip in demand or the bump in demand and say, okay, let's prepare the machines, we're going to ramp up production?
Um, they used to, but I think a lot of them have learned. And I think, for example, you're seeing it in the oil and gas and the mining industry. You're seeing, for example, how commodity prices are going through the roof, yet mining companies are being extremely prudent about going back, increasing the rig count, massively spending, etc. No? So I think that there was a period of time between the mid 90s to the financial crisis in which businesses tended to react pro-cyclically. In the sense that they tended to decide to invest more when they saw an increase in demand. But now what they're doing is being a lot more prudent in order to preserve the strength of the business from false sort of demand signals. No.
Interesting. So this is also adding fuel to these inflationary pressures that we're seeing.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why when people think that capital expenditure weakness is going to drive deflation, it's a mistake because there is a very likely scenario that a lot of the inflationary pressures remain sticky in the process and that businesses are not going to generate further and higher capacity simply because of a price hike.
So interesting. Daniel Lacalle, Tressis, thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.